Good to be with you for sure, and I certainly want to acknowledge Monsignor and Ben for their creativity and leadership in offering such a program, because when I was first invited to be a part of it, I thought that's a great way to kind of dig into what we're calling a 3-year program of Eucharistic renewal or revival. And having just begun our Lenten journey 8 days ago, the topic that you've chosen for this evening, sacrifice, couldn't be more timely, because the 3 familiar disciplines that we hear from Jesus every year on Ash Wednesday in the Gospel are prayer, fasting, and almsgiving, or works of mercy. And all 3 of them come out of this whole notion of what we would call sacrificial love, because in our lives each year, as best and as humbly as we can do, we try to open our hearts, particularly in Lent, to that outpouring of the heart of Christ upon each one of us and upon our world. Greater love than this no one has, than one lay down one's life for one's friends. And we call that form of love sacrificial. Sacrifice is the highest form of love. And you and I become familiar with it, but sometimes a little confused by it when we read the Old Testament and we see the particular attention that's given to the people of God to offer the best sheep, the finest lamb, the first crops of the harvest, whatever it is, to offer to God the very best. And you know how we get confused every year when we hear the story of Abraham and Isaac, and they're going up to offer sacrifice. And Isaac says, we have the wood, but where is the lamb, the ram? And Abraham says, God will provide. But in a strange moment of trust, Abraham is prepared to offer his firstborn. And we know that we'll hear that again when Jesus celebrates his baptism. You are my beloved Son, on whom my favor rests. So the Father, God the Father, was willing and ready to offer his beloved Son. Jesus would take this bar of sacrificial love, the highest form of love, and raise it even to a higher level. He gathered, as many of his ancestors in the faith would gather, in celebrating a very detailed ritual that you and I hear every year on Holy Thursday from the book of Exodus, the Passover meal. And yet on that night that we remember every time we celebrate the Eucharist, Jesus took this ritual and he transformed it, not only with different words, but with his body and blood, and told us and told them to do this in memory of him. So it's no wonder that those who were present that night scratched their heads and said, what's he talking about? They had no idea that what would happen within a few hours would be his arrest, his trial, and his passion and death. So Sunday after Sunday, we gather here at this altar of sacrifice, or table of sacrifice. And some of you here are at least as old or a little older than I am. And you know that we were very comfortable in using the term the holy sacrifice of the Mass, right? And sometimes we still use that word today, particularly if you get a Mass card for a deceased person. In that print is often the word, the holy sacrifice of the Mass will be offered for the eternal rest of your mother or your father. But even though we see that word, we hear it and use it, we might think that somehow or another we're not always talking about sacrifice. We'll talk about Mass and communion and go into church. But why is the sacrificial aspect of the Holy Eucharist so central to not only what we do here, but how we try to put the Holy Eucharist into action, into life, day in and day out? Even if you and I are not regular about that word, listen to the way the presider invites us to participate in every Mass we celebrate. Pray, brothers and sisters, that my sacrifice and yours may be acceptable to God, the Almighty Father. Pretty clear. How do we respond? May the Lord accept this sacrifice at our hands for our good and the good of all his holy church. Sacrifice for our good and the good of all his holy church. And then in Eucharistic prayer too, which we've been using pretty much during the COVID because it's the shortest, for one thing, what else do we hear? At the time he was betrayed and entered willingly into his passion, he took bread and took wine. Take, eat, drink. This is given for you. This is given for us. Do this in memory of me. Powerful words. Betrayed, willingly, broke, take, eat, and drink, and do this. All kind of verbs, action words, inviting us to get into it, to make his sacrifice and our sacrifice one. So as we enter into the sacrifice of Jesus in the sacrament of the Holy Eucharist, we're invited to offer our personal gifts of our lives of sacrificial love. Where in our lives have you and I been called to imitate Jesus in such a free and generous offering of ourselves in the face of often mundane responsibilities, routine activities, misunderstandings, inconvenience, being tired, discouraged, out of focus, feeling unappreciated, all the rest, and not to stop, but to keep loving as we near every year on Holy Thursday, like Jesus in the gospel that says he loved them to the end. That's what the Eucharist as sacrifice enables us or inspires us to do, to imitate that highest form of love for Jesus and for one another. You know, again, during COVID, that kind of got canceled, but we have this kind of token sense of this when people bring up the offerings. Most of the time, we just think of it in terms of the collection. And yet they do bring up bread and wine. And those are the gifts of us, the gifts of the people of God. And they're meant to represent our efforts, as humble as they might be, as insignificant as we might judge them to be, of offering that same spirit of sacrifice in our daily living. Let me offer one, I believe, outstanding example, and then maybe bring it a little more closer to home. You know that particularly with Pope St. John Paul the Great and Pope Benedict and now Pope Francis, that men and women have been canonized in great numbers in our church recently. Prior to that, I think Elizabeth Ann Seton was the only one canonized for like years and years. And, you know, people were astounded that someone born in our own United States would then be canonized. Well, there was a man canonized back in the 80s, and he was a priest, Father Maximilian Kolbe. You might know the story about him. It's extremely moving. He was a Franciscan priest, and he was imprisoned in Auschwitz. And there had been an escape in his barracks, and the commandant come in one day, announced the mistake, and there would be a penalty, and he would want to sacrifice 10 more prisoners. And he just went 1, 2, 3, 4, 7, 8, 9, 10. And there was a man there that knelt down and started to cry. And he said, "I'll never see my wife and children again." Father Colby, without being invited, raised his hand and said, "I will take his place." Commandant didn't care. He was just looking for 10 bodies. And they accepted his offer. And it was unfortunately not a quick death, but he died, and of course was raised to the dignity of one of the official saints in the church. When that day happened, guess who was in St. Peter's Square? The man who would have died. You and I can't do that in a way, right? That's rather heroic. There might be some opportunity that would come our way that it would be similar, but that is amazing. But to make it a little more a part of us, I'd like to talk about two realities especially that are very clear to us and represented here this evening. Many of you are married, and prior to the Second Vatican Council, the priest used to use, if he wished, a prepared exhortation to the bride and groom prior to the exchange of vows. And after I'm finished speaking, you'll have a copy of this and 2 other things that I'll be reading for your own meditation tonight and in the future. And this is part of what the priest would say to that young man and woman embarking upon the great vocation that we call marriage. The priest would say, "And so, not knowing what is before you, you take each other for better or for worse, for richer or for poorer, in sickness and in health, until death." These words then are most serious, and because these words involve such solemn obligations, it is most fitting that you rest the security of your wedded life on the great principle of self-sacrifice. And whatever sacrifices you may be hereafter required to make this common life, always make them generously. There will be problems which you might find difficult, but genuine love can make them easy, and perfect love can make them a joy, for we are willing to give in proportion as we love, and greater love than this no one has, than one lay down one's life for one's friends. When love is perfect, the sacrifice is complete. That's what you who enjoy that vocation of marriage, we're called to become a visible living sign of this sacrificial love that brings us together every time we gather for the Eucharist. And you've done it, and you continue to do it in terms of the daily gift of self to your spouse and to your children, as well as to your neighbor. And how easy it is for you, I presume, to kind of play that down. No big thing, but day after day, and people blessed to be married for 50, 60, 70 years. What a gift that is, not only to God and to your family, but to our church. Father Ben, is rather new, just ordained back in May. And he would remember that once the bishop imposed hands, once his hands were anointed with sacred chrism, and once he was vested in the chasuble and stole, that either his parents or one of the parents of the men to be ordained would come up with the chalice and the paten of bread. And each person to be ordained would come forward, and they would put their hands around the gifts of God's people. And this is what the bishop would pray. My son, receive the oblation of the holy people to be offered to God. Understand what you do, imitate what you celebrate, and conform your life to the mystery of the Lord's cross. Personally, I found that one of the more moving parts of ordination 50 years ago, especially the closing line, and conform your life to the mystery of the Lord's cross. That's sacrificial love. That's the gift we celebrate with Jesus here and each other every time we gather. And that's how you and I are enabled to keep doing that. Because to try to offer sacrificial love without the inspiration and the nourishment of the sacred body and blood of Jesus Christ is more than an uphill battle. It's very easy for us to begin to draw back, to hold back on that free gift of self which we're meant to offer day in and day out. So I would just encourage you and myself in these early moments of Lent, as well as this very fine program that's still going on for you in these respective parishes on the Eucharist, not to be embarrassed or to judge your gift, the oblation, as the bishop would say to the newly ordained, the oblation of the holy people. Don't judge it to be insignificant. The contribution that you make in imitation of Jesus. As Jesus did in the multiplication of the loaves and fish, allow him, because we can't do it, allow him to multiply our sacrifices for your good, for our good, and the good of all his holy church. Our Holy Father, Pope Francis, recently preached the following about the gift of the Holy Eucharist. He said, how many mothers, how many fathers, together with the slices of bread they provide each day on the tables of their homes, have broken their hearts to let their children grow and grow well. How many Christians, as responsible citizens, have broken their own lives to defend the dignity of all, especially the poorest, the marginalized, and those discriminated. Where do they find the strength to do this? It is in the Eucharist, in the power of the risen Lord's love, who today breaks bread for us and repeats again and again, do this in remembrance of me.